Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Dad looked me dead in the eye the day after I turned 18 and said, "Figure out life yourself. You're not getting a dime from us." No emotion, no hesitation, just a fact delivered like he was talking about the weather. I remember sitting at the edge of the kitchen table, still in my pajamas, toast halfway to my mouth, when he dropped the bomb. My mom didn't even look up from folding laundry at the couch. That was their way, silent support for each other, unified in decision, even when the blow landed right in the chest of their kid. It wasn't like I had been out partying or slacking off. I graduated high school with a 3.9 GPA, worked weekends at a local diner since junior year, and got into a decent state university with partial aid. I didn't expect a parade. I just thought, stupidly maybe, that they'd help with something, a textbook, a used laptop, maybe even just a good luck hug. But no. That morning in June, I got a hard dose of real-world prep and a shrug from the woman who gave birth to me. Dad said, "You think you're ready for the world? Then show us." That was his version of a pep talk. So I packed up my Honda Civic, no AC, backseat held together with duct tape, and drove 4 hours to a campus I'd only seen once on a rainy tour day. I had $824 in my checking account. That was it. Enough to cover 2 months of rent in a shared off-campus apartment with 3 other girls I found through a Facebook housing group, and maybe some groceries if I skipped eating out entirely. My roommate had a cat she didn't tell me about, and my ceiling fan sounded like it was coughing every time I turned it on, but it was mine. For those first few weeks, I lived off instant noodles and dollar coffee, clinging to the hope that this was just my version of a rough beginning. Everyone goes through it, right? I mean, that's what those cheesy dorm posters say. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But that quote doesn't tell you what happens when the hardship feels more like punishment than growth. I called home twice that month. Once to tell them I got a work-study position at the library, barely above minimum wage, but better than nothing. The second time was just because I missed hearing someone say my name. Both times, I got voicemail. Then 2 months into my first semester, I got a call from my cousin Hannah. We're not that close, but she's the kind of person who always knows everyone's business before it hits Facebook. Her voice was all hesitant, like she was afraid of how I'd react. "Hey, Rach, I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but I thought you should know. Your dad just gave Chris 20 grand for a down payment on a condo downtown." I remember blinking like I hadn't heard her right. "For what?" "For a condo," she repeated like I was slow. "Your parents co-signed the loan and everything. It's in his name, but they gave him the deposit." I laughed. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity hit me like a slap in the face. Chris, my younger brother, was still living at home. He'd barely passed high school, never held a job for more than a few weeks, and once told our mom he couldn't do laundry because the buttons confused him. But apparently he was mature enough to own property. And I, their straight-A daughter, the one who never even got detention, was told to sink or swim without a life jacket. I didn't cry that night. I cleaned the whole apartment. I scrubbed the bathroom floor with a sponge and no gloves until my knuckles were raw. That's what I do when I'm angry. I clean. My roommates probably thought I was having a mental breakdown, and maybe I was. But I needed something to do with my hands because the idea of calling home and screaming felt both pointless and humiliating. I didn't call again after that. A week later, I sold my guitar, my high school graduation gift from my uncle, the only one in the family who ever really got me, and used the money to buy used textbooks for the next semester. I applied for every scholarship I could find online, stayed up late rewriting essays for $500 stipends, and joined a campus research group for a monthly stipend that barely paid for groceries, but gave me access to professors who actually listened when I talked. Every time I passed by a family on campus, helping their kid move into the dorms or dropping off care packages, I looked away. It wasn't jealousy. It was more like watching a scene from a movie you used to love, but now can't relate to. That version of me, the one who thought family had your back just because they were family, was gone. I started lying when people asked about my parents. I'd say they were busy or traveling or living abroad. Sometimes I'd pretend I didn't have any. People don't question much when you act like you're fine. But the truth is, it wasn't just the money, it was the choice. They didn't say we can't, and they said we won't. They looked at me, decided I was strong enough to go it alone, and washed their hands of me like that was some kind of compliment. Maybe they thought they were toughening me up. Maybe they thought they were being fair. But when I saw that Instagram post from Chris standing in front of his new place, keys in hand, caption, "Thanks, Mom and Dad," something in me snapped. I realized they never saw me as the kid who needed help. I was the experiment. Chris was the investment. That was the night I stopped wishing for them to call. That was the night I started planning a future that had no space left for any of them in it. By the time the fall leaves started turning that sharp, moody red across campus, I had already developed a routine that kept me just barely afloat and just far enough from completely losing my mind. I woke up before sunrise, studied for 2 hours in the library before my first class, grabbed whatever food was being handed out in the quad, sometimes granola bars, sometimes bagels if I got lucky, and then dashed off to my work-study shift. I shelved books like a machine, ignoring the ache in my back and the way my eyes blurred after hours of reading tiny print on dusty spines. When classes ended in the afternoon, I pulled double duty waiting tables at a little diner off campus until midnight. Most nights, I got home smelling like burnt coffee and grease, too tired to shower, but too wired from stress to sleep. There was no margin for error. One mistake, one missed rent payment, one sprained ankle, one emergency dentist appointment. Any of that could have knocked me out cold. But I kept grinding. I kept my head down. I kept my grades up. And I told myself every single night when I stared at the ceiling from a mattress that sagged in the middle that I was going to get through this. Not because I wanted to prove them wrong, not yet anyway, but because I didn't see another option. Survival has a funny way of becoming your full-time job when no one is picking up the phone on the other end. And still, even then, even after I'd stopped calling and stopped hoping, some part of me was waiting for my dad to change his mind, waiting for my mom to send a card or maybe just a note scribbled in her familiar loopy handwriting, saying she missed me. I think I would have forgiven them right then and there if they had just admitted they made a mistake. But nothing ever came. No call, no text, no email. It was like I had been erased. Meanwhile, Chris's life was being documented in real time on every social media platform known to man. Every other day, there was a post of him lounging on a white leather couch in his new place, his feet up on the coffee table like he'd worked for it. Sometimes it was photos from brunches at trendy spots downtown. Sometimes it was pictures of him at bars with friends, always with the same stupid, smug grin on his face. He wasn't working, he wasn't studying, he wasn't doing anything really, but the world kept handing him little victories, as if just being Chris was accomplishment enough. That was when it hit me. I wasn't just unlucky. I was the dry run. I was the test subject they'd tried to launch into the world without directions or parachutes, just to see what would happen. And when it looked too messy, when the fallout seemed too risky, they adjusted the formula. Chris was the revision, the polished product. All the things they didn't do for me, they poured into him. I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head, over and over again. Life isn't fair, Rachel. You gotta learn that early. And maybe he thought that made him wise. Maybe he thought it built character. But all it really did was make it clear how much more value they placed on my brother's comfort than on my survival. So I stopped mourning. I stopped wondering. I cut them out completely, not out of spite, but because trying to keep them in my life was draining energy I didn't have. I blocked their numbers, I deleted their emails, I told my professors not to list my parents in any contact forms, just in case something happened to me. It felt extreme, but it also felt necessary. I needed space to breathe, to fail quietly, to rebuild without their shadow stretching over me. Around that time, something unexpected happened. I was working late one night in the campus library, barely staying awake, when one of the senior research assistants struck up a conversation with me. His name was Malik. He had this calm presence, like someone who never rushed unless it mattered. We talked for a bit, and before he left, he asked me if I'd be interested in applying for a position in a community health research group he was helping coordinate. It was part-time, paid, and came with a meal card. I almost cried when he said it. That opportunity cracked open a door I didn't know existed. For the first time since leaving home, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I worked with a small team of women, mostly first-gen college students, most of them dealing with their own messy family histories, and we built something together. I wasn't just collecting a paycheck. I was contributing to real conversations, helping design real programs, and learning skills I couldn't have even imagined back in high school. It didn't pay a lot, but it paid attention, and that mattered more than I thought it would. Around this time, I started writing again. Just little entries in a journal at first, then longer essays, and finally a blog. I didn't attach my name, I didn't tell anyone about it, but I poured everything into it. The anger, the exhaustion, the way it felt to be cast aside by people who were supposed to love you without condition. I called it the unfunded daughter. It was raw, kind of messy, and probably too emotional, but it struck a chord. People started sharing it. Comments rolled in from other women who said they saw themselves in every post. I wasn't alone. I wasn't invisible. That was my first little victory. Quiet, anonymous, but powerful. I didn't need my family to validate my experience anymore. Strangers were doing that for me, and their voices were louder than the silence I had grown used to. I didn't tell anyone about Chris's condo or about the 20 grand. I never mentioned the text messages I had sent that were left unread or the birthday card that never came. I didn't complain or ask for pity. I just kept showing up, kept hustling, and let the rage fuel my ambition. Not in a reckless way, but in a focused, surgical way. I was done asking for space. I was taking it. Then, during winter break, I got a letter from the university. It was thick and official looking. I opened it on my walk back from class, the cold biting into my fingers. Inside was a single-page award notification. I had been selected for a full academic grant, covering tuition for the next 2 years, housing stipend, meal plan, and a small monthly living allowance included. It wasn't a miracle. It was a reward for not giving up, for showing up, for getting it done when nobody was watching. And I didn't tell a soul. Not Molly, not my roommates, definitely not my family, because in that moment, I knew something with absolute certainty. If they didn't want me then, they didn't get to have me now. Spring semester came in hard and fast, and with it came a new pace I wasn't quite prepared for, though I adapted the way I always did, quietly and with a kind of quiet stubbornness that nobody noticed, but that I carried like armor. My days stretched longer, but the difference was, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting to move with purpose, not just scrambling to stay above water. Every class I showed up to, every research report I handed in, every late-night brainstorming session with the team, it all felt like the scaffolding of a life I was building from scratch. And though the foundation still felt shaky on some days, it was mine. I was building it on my own terms, and nobody was standing behind me holding a safety net, which, strange as it sounds, started to feel like a blessing instead of a curse. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes with cutting ties with the people who once raised you. It isn't loud or dramatic. It's not even about the big moments, birthdays, holidays, that sudden urge to call someone when you hear a song from your childhood. It's in the small, unshareable victories. The exam you aced that nobody knows you stayed up 3 nights straight studying for. The afternoon you laughed so hard at lunch with your project team that you forgot, for a second, how tired you were. It's realizing you have nobody to call, just to say, hey, I think I'm going to be okay. I remember walking into the campus gym one afternoon, mostly just to use the free showers because the water in our apartment had gone out again. And I caught my reflection in the wall-length mirror. I barely recognized myself. Not in some melodramatic movie moment way, but literally, I looked older, not just tired, but tougher. My hair was thrown into a bun that had clearly seen better days. I had dark circles that no concealer could fix, and I was wearing the same leggings I'd spilled coffee on 3 days ago. But I looked, sure, like someone who knew she wouldn't break. I stood there for a long moment, staring at that version of me, the one that was still standing after being pushed so far out of every comfort zone I ever had. And I almost smiled. Still, even with everything going right for once, the shadows didn't quite let go. I had nightmares that semester, always variations of the same thing. I was back at my parents' house, trying to explain everything I had done, trying to get them to see me, but every time I opened my mouth, no sound came out. They'd look at me, but through me, like I wasn't really there. Chris would be sitting in the corner, legs kicked up, tossing keys to his condo in one hand like a toy, while my father muttered something about personal responsibility. I'd wake up breathless, tangled in sheets damp with sweat, my chest heavy with all the words I never got to say. Instead of running from it, I started channeling it. One of my professors, Dr. Marin, encouraged me to apply for a campus-wide speech contest, open to juniors and seniors in the social sciences. The winner would get a platform at the graduation ceremony, 5 minutes to speak to the entire graduating class, faculty, parents, donors, and community leaders. I wasn't even sure if I was eligible yet, but she pushed me to try anyway. She said, "Rachel, you've got something to say, and people need to hear it." I didn't tell her that I had written my speech 3 months before the contest even opened. The working title was Who You Leave Behind. And it wasn't about anger or revenge, at least not on the surface. It was about expectations and silence, and what it costs a person to build a life with no instructions, no encouragement, and no safety net. I wrote it in the voice of a daughter who learned to mother herself. I wrote it in the voice of every young woman who watched her brother get handouts while she was told to tough it out. I wrote it like it was the last thing I'd ever get to say to the world. It was raw, it was vulnerable, and it was honest in a way that made my hands shake every time I edited it. When I submitted it, I expected rejection. Not because it wasn't good, I knew it was good, but because stories like mine don't usually make it to the stage. They're too uncomfortable, too real, too messy. But 2 weeks later, I got the email. I was selected as one of the finalists. They wanted me to read it live for the final round. No notes, no second takes, just me, a microphone, and a crowd. I stood in front of that panel, my palms sweating so badly I was sure the mic would slip right out of my hand. And I delivered the speech exactly the way I had practiced 100 times in my mirror. When I finished, there was a silence that scared me for a second. Then someone clapped, then another, and within seconds, the whole room was standing. A week later, I found out I won. It didn't feel real. Not because I didn't think I deserved it, I did, but because it was the first time someone officially acknowledged the work I had put in. There was a weird kind of grief in that too, that my validation had to come from strangers because the people who were supposed to care had chosen to look the other way. I didn't tell my family, not my mother, not Chris, certainly not my father. I didn't want their pride, not after everything. I wanted them to stay exactly where they had placed themselves, outside the world I was building. Instead, I called Malik, and I called Dr. Marin, and I called my roommate, who brought me takeout and cried with me on the floor because she knew what it meant even if I barely said a word. The ceremony was 3 months away, and my name would be printed in the program as the student speaker. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, not as anyone's anything. Just as Rachel Martin, graduating senior, public health major, and the girl who learned to stand on her own. And when I finally walked across that stage, I wasn't going to look out into the crowd, hoping to see my family's faces. I had decided that if they showed up, they wouldn't recognize who they were looking at anyway. The day of the ceremony started like any other, which somehow made the whole thing even more surreal. The sun was already punching through my bedroom window by the time I finally rolled out of bed, having barely slept the night before. My cap and gown were hanging on the back of the door, pressed and ready, the deep navy color contrasting against the pale paint like a bold sentence someone had finally dared to write. I moved around the apartment in slow motion, brushing my teeth with one hand while scrolling through my speech one more time with the other, not because I didn't know it, but because keeping my eyes on it gave my thoughts something to hold on to. I hadn't told anyone in my family that I was graduating. Not once. Not in the 4 years I had pushed and scraped and fought my way through this maze of paperwork and cheap pasta, and late-night studying and broken-down cars, and iced-over windows and little victories I learned not to share. I never sent them a photo. I never gave them my new address. They still thought I'd dropped out after the first semester. And part of me wanted to keep it that way, not out of spite, but because giving them a seat in this audience felt like an insult to the version of me that had carried herself across every mile of this journey, bleeding at the feet and still marching. But the universe, as always, had a cruel sense of humor. I was walking across the commons toward the main auditorium when I heard the voice. That voice, the one that had once barked out, eyes forward, at soccer games, and sit up straight at dinner. It didn't come as a shout. Not this time. It came low and casual, in conversation, like it belonged there in the morning sun. I slowed just enough to listen without turning around. My mother was speaking to someone, her tone overly bright, the way it got when she was trying to impress. "Oh, we're just here for Chris's girlfriend's cousin. He's in the business school. Not a big deal." Not a big deal. It was such a simple sentence. Harmless if you didn't know better, but it landed like a sucker punch to the ribs. They were here, at my university, sitting in the crowd with their expensive shoes and their borrowed smiles, for a stranger who had somehow managed to score a bigger piece of their attention than I had in 4 years of blood, sweat, and silence. I didn't turn around. I didn't confront them. I didn't even breathe for a full 10 seconds. I just kept walking, slow and steady, my fingers curling into my palms as the irony of it all wrapped around me like a bitter perfume. Backstage, the energy buzzed like it always does before a big event. Students fidgeting with their tassels, volunteers running clipboards and headsets, faculty double-checking name pronunciations on note cards. I stood off to the side, gripping the speech that I knew line for line, pretending to listen to the final instructions. I could hear the murmurs through the curtains, the shuffling of hundreds of bodies settling into seats, the low thrum of anticipation that had nothing to do with me and yet somehow everything. They announced the ceremony would begin shortly. The lights dimmed, the processional music started, and with every step I took onto that stage, I shed another piece of the old skin that had tried for too long to keep me small. When they called my name, Rachel Martin, student speaker, there was polite applause, nothing thunderous, no standing ovation, but that wasn't what I was here for. I walked to the podium with calm steps, careful not to let my blue guy robe trip me, careful not to let my heart trip me either. I scanned the crowd once, just once, and I saw them. 3rd row from the front. My father, ramrod straight in a button-down shirt, he probably ironed himself. My mother beside him, one hand clasping a program, her lips slightly parted in what looked like confusion. And Chris slouched in his seat, scrolling through something on his phone. None of them recognized me right away. I took the mic and looked out at the sea of strangers and half-strangers and almost friends. And I smiled the way you smile when you've rehearsed something to the edge of madness. And then I began. Sometimes, the people who raise you will only see you when you become unrecognizable. Sometimes, they miss the version of you that obeyed, that bent, that accepted. And when you grow out of that version, when you become something sharper and stranger and stronger, they won't understand that it's not rebellion, it's survival. There was no gasping, no dramatic background music, no pointing fingers. Just me and the microphone and the weight of everything I had been carrying for 4 long years. I spoke slowly, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted every word to sink in, every sentence to stretch across the room and land like a quiet detonation. I talked about struggle without rescue. I talked about pride without praise. I talked about what it meant to build a future from splinters and shame and still stand tall enough to see the horizon. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. My eyes met my father's once, just briefly, and I saw it. The flicker, the tightening around his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the program like it might float away. My mother was blinking, fast, like she couldn't tell if this was a dream or a story someone else had written. Chris never looked up. When I stepped away from the podium, there was silence, just for a second. And then it came, clapping, slow and genuine, not loud, but steady. I didn't look back at my family. I didn't wait for them to approach. I exited stage left, through the side curtain, out into the hallway where the noise was muffled and the air felt thin. I stood alone for just a moment and it felt right, because the applause wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that they saw me, and not just me, the daughter who had failed to fit the mold, the sister who had been pushed to the background, the girl who had been told to figure it out and not ask questions. They saw what came of all that. And the most satisfying part wasn't their silence. It was that I didn't need their response anymore. After the ceremony, I didn't linger near the stage like the other speakers. I slipped out through a side corridor, not because I was avoiding anyone, but because I needed to reclaim the quiet. I needed a moment to let the sound of applause fade out of my ears so I could think clearly again, because despite what I told myself, despite every boundary I had drawn, I knew they would come. Maybe not all of them, maybe not right away, but they would come. They always did eventually, when the work was done and the spotlight was warm. And they could arrive without having to do any of the heavy lifting. I wasn't waiting for them. I didn't need to anymore, but I had rehearsed their arrival like a mental dance I couldn't seem to stop performing, even if I never planned to let them lead again. I stood outside the building, half in the shadow of a brick archway, watching graduates take photos, toss their caps, hug their proud parents, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel a sense of longing. What I felt was sharper, more finite, like the click of a door being locked from the inside. They had missed it. Not just the ceremony or the speech. They had missed all of it. The lonely bus rides, the unpaid internships, the ramen dinners, the nights I thought I wouldn't make it, and the mornings I got up anyway. That was the real loss, and they didn't even know enough to mourn it. When I saw them walking toward me, I didn't move. I stayed rooted to the spot, arms crossed, face neutral, because I wasn't going to make this easy for them. My mother reached me first, eyes glossy, the kind of artificial shine that comes from too much guilt and not enough actual reflection. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something tender, something warm, something that might almost count as an apology. But instead what came out was, "You look so grown up." I didn't answer. I just looked at her, not with hate, not even with anger, just with the cool, steady stare of someone who had learned to recognize performative regret and treat it like background noise. My father, always the one who thought silence was a sign of wisdom, stood next to her, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. He looked at me like he was measuring something, like he couldn't quite reconcile the woman in front of him with the daughter he'd once dismissed over breakfast, like an item scratched off a grocery list. He nodded once stiffly, like that might count for something. And then Chris showed up. He strolled up behind them, sunglasses pushed onto his head, sleeves rolled up like he'd just stepped out of a brunch commercial. He gave me a lazy grin, the same one he'd always used to charm his way out of consequences, and said, "Guess you figured it out, huh?" I stared at him for a long second, the absurdity of the moment hitting me like a slap I should have expected, but still stung anyway. And then, for the first time that day, I laughed. Not loud, not cruel, just a low, knowing sound that cut through the stiffness in the air like a blade. I shook my head, took a slow step forward, and said, "No thanks to any of you." That should have been the end of it, and maybe it was in some ways. I walked past them after that, not fast, not dramatic, just forward. I didn't invite them to dinner. I didn't suggest a photo. I didn't ask for closure. I'd already taken it. And what none of them understood, what they probably still don't, is that the real revenge was never about making them sorry. It was about making them irrelevant. In the weeks that followed, life didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated. I received 2 job offers, both from high-profile organizations that would have made great additions to any resume, but neither of them felt right. I'd spent 4 years navigating a world where every door had to be broken into with bare hands, and now that doors were opening on their own, I realized I wasn't interested in simply walking through them to fit someone else's version of success. So I took a different offer, less glamorous, lower pay, more demanding, but it was with a nonprofit organization that focused on educational equity for young women from underserved communities. They offered me a role designing peer mentorship programs for girls who had aged out of foster care or had no family support systems to speak of. It felt personal, maybe too personal, but in the best way. I wasn't just working. I was building bridges I had once needed myself. The blog, the one I had started anonymously during my lowest point, had quietly grown into something much bigger than I ever anticipated. Submissions from readers began piling in, women of all ages sharing their stories, some eerily similar to mine, others even more heartbreaking. I curated their words with care, featured essays, built resource pages, and eventually caught the attention of a small but passionate publisher who asked if I'd consider turning the project into a memoir. I said yes, not because I needed to be heard, but because I knew someone else out there needed to feel seen. When the advance came in, I didn't call my parents. I didn't text Chris. I didn't even hesitate. But a month before the book's official announcement, a letter arrived at my apartment. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unmistakable, my father's. It wasn't long. It wasn't even a full page. It didn't start with Dear Rachel, and it didn't end with Love, Dad. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments of what had happened, no reference to the speech, the silence, or the time lost. Just one sentence, scrawled in his square mechanical lettering. Was it all necessary? I read it twice, then a third time, trying to find the hidden message, the kernel of softness, the buried truth. But there was nothing else. I didn't write back. I didn't have to. Some questions don't deserve answers, and some stories don't need a reunion. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is keep moving, with your head high, your voice steady, and your back turned to the people who thought you'd crawl back for crumbs once you figured out how to walk. I stood on that stage alone because I had earned every inch of that moment. No dime, no help, no return, just me and the life I built, one brick at a time.